But Traoré had already moved beyond their reach. The partnerships with Russia, Turkey, and China weren't just economic relationships. They were strategic alliances with nations that offered trade without requiring political submission. The infrastructure development across Burkina Faso tells the real story. Roads connecting previously isolated rural communities. Electricity reaching villages that had been dark for generations. Schools where children learn that their nation's wealth belongs to them, not to distant shareholders. The healthcare improvements are transformative. Clinics and hospitals funded directly by gold revenue, providing care to communities that had been medically abandoned. Mothers giving birth safely, children receiving vaccines, families accessing clean water. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological transformation is unprecedented. An entire generation of Burkinabe children is growing up knowing that their nation's resources serve their development, not someone else's profit margins. This is what sovereignty looks like. This is what happens when a leader chooses national development over international approval. This is the blueprint that terrifies global power structures. The Ibrahim Traoré model isn't just about one country. It's about every nation that has been told its poverty is inevitable while its resources enrich foreign powers. It's about every community that has been displaced from mining operations while shareholders celebrate record profits. It's about every leader who has been forced to choose between international approval and national development. What we're witnessing isn't just African liberation. It's the emergence of a new global order where resource-rich nations refuse to subsidize their own exploitation. The establishment knows this. That's why they're working so hard to contain the example. Because if the Ibrahim Traoré model spreads, if other nations begin auditing their mining contracts, canceling exploitative agreements, and demanding transparency, the entire system of global wealth extraction collapses. We're not just watching one country's transformation. We're witnessing the birth of a movement that could reshape global power dynamics forever. The young soldiers, teachers, farmers, and mothers who support Ibrahim Traoré aren't just celebrating better governance. They're proving that another world is possible. A world where natural resources serve the people who live above them. A world where development means empowerment, not dependency. A world where sovereignty isn't just a political concept, it's an economic reality. And here's the most important part. You're part of this story. Every time you share content like this, every time you challenge the mainstream narrative about Africa, every time you refuse to accept that poverty is destiny for resource-rich nations, you're contributing to a global awakening. The sun that rises over Burkina Faso's golden plains isn't just illuminating one nation's transformation. It's revealing possibilities that exist wherever people decide that their wealth belongs to them, not to distant powers who profit from their poverty. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just steal back his nation's gold. He stole back the future. And that future is spreading across continents, inspiring movements, and terrifying establishments that have profited from artificial scarcity for far too long. The revolution isn't just happening in West Africa. It's happening wherever people refuse to accept that exploitation is normal, that dependency is inevitable, and that sovereignty is impossible. The question isn't whether this model will spread. The question is how quickly and how far, and whether global power structures can adapt to a world where resource-rich nations refuse to remain artificially poor. This is our moment. This is our chance to be part of something larger than ourselves. Subscribe to this channel because content like this is exactly why we exist, to reveal the hidden dynamics that shape our world and to celebrate the leaders who dare to change them. Share this story. Discuss it. Question everything you've been told about global economics, about African development, about who gets to control the world's resources. Because the young captain who stole back a nation's gold didn't just transform Burkina Faso. He showed us all what's possible when leaders choose courage over comfort, sovereignty over submission, and the people over the powerful. The future is being written right now, and you get to decide what role you'll play in this story. The contracts were masterpieces of sophisticated theft. Foreign companies weren't just taking most of the profits. They were paying virtually nothing in taxes, receiving free infrastructure development, and operating with environmental standards that would be illegal in their home countries. We're talking about agreements that literally required Burkina Faso to pay for the privilege of being robbed. One contract reviewed by Traoré's team showed a foreign corporation extracting over $200 million in gold annually, while paying less than $5 million in taxes and royalties. Another gave a company the right to operate for 25 years with guaranteed extensions, essentially creating a colonial relationship disguised as commerce. The environmental assessments were equally explosive. Companies were dumping toxic waste into water sources, destroying farmland, and operating without proper reclamation plans. The health costs alone: children with respiratory diseases, communities with poisoned water, farmers with contaminated soil, represented millions in damages that the foreign companies never paid. But here's where Traoré's military background became his secret weapon. He understood that exposing the problem wasn't enough. He needed to systematically dismantle the entire extraction system. Before we continue with this incredible story of liberation, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our amazing community here. If you're watching this, you're part of a movement that refuses to accept the mainstream narrative about Africa, about power, and about who gets to control the world's resources. Your engagement, your comments, your shares, they're not just metrics to us. They're proof that people everywhere are hungry for truth that challenges the system. Subscribe if you haven't already, because stories like Ibrahim Traoré's are exactly why we exist, to reveal the hidden dynamics that shape our world and to celebrate the leaders who dare to change them. Now, back to the revolution that's reshaping global power dynamics. Traoré's next move was tactical brilliance. Instead of trying to renegotiate exploitative contracts, he simply canceled them. Foreign companies that had operated with impunity for decades suddenly found their mining licenses revoked. Executives who had treated Burkina Faso as their personal extraction zone were told to leave. The international reaction was immediate and revealing. Western governments that had never shown concern for Burkina Faso's poverty suddenly became very interested in its democratic development. Mining companies that had extracted billions while communities suffered began talking about investment uncertainty and rule of law. But Traoré had anticipated this. He wasn't just taking back the mines. He was building an entirely new system. The creation of state-led mining operations was revolutionary. Instead of foreign companies extracting gold and shipping profits overseas, Burkina Faso began operating its own mines through a combination of military oversight and civil engineering expertise. The Bungu and Wagnian mines, previously owned by foreign corporations, became symbols of national reclamation. But here's the masterstroke. Traoré didn't just want government control. He wanted transparency so radical that it would become impossible for future leaders to sell out the nation's resources. The gold revenue dashboard was genius-level transparency. Every citizen could see exactly how much gold was being extracted, how much was being sold, and where every dollar was being spent. This wasn't just good governance. It was a political innovation that made corruption virtually impossible. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within months, communities that had been bypassed by development for decades began seeing new schools, hospitals, and roads. The gold that had once disappeared into foreign bank accounts was now building the infrastructure that foreign companies had promised but never delivered. Villages that had been isolated for generations were connected to power grids. Children who had never seen a doctor were receiving healthcare. Farmers who had struggled with broken roads were able to transport their goods to markets. But the real transformation was psychological. For the first time in their lives, the people of Burkina Faso could see their natural wealth working for them instead of against them. The international establishment was panicking. This wasn't supposed to happen. Resource-rich African nations were supposed to remain dependent, their wealth flowing outward, their people grateful for whatever scraps filtered down through foreign investment. Ibrahim Traoré had broken the rules, and the world would never be the same. The earthquake that shook the world, what happened next, reveals the true scope of what Ibrahim Traoré accomplished. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso's gold. It was about exposing a global system that has kept entire continents in artificial poverty for generations. The numbers tell a story that will transform how you understand global economics forever. In less than 3 years, Burkina Faso went from being systematically robbed to generating over $18 billion in revenue directly linked to gold production. That's not just economic success. That's the difference between dependency and sovereignty. But here's what the international media won't tell you. Those numbers represent something far more threatening to the global establishment than African prosperity. They represent proof that the entire narrative about developing nations and foreign investment is a carefully constructed lie. Think about it. If a small landlocked nation can generate $18 billion in 3 years simply by controlling its own resources, what does that say about every other resource-rich country that remains poor? What does it say about the international financial system that considers dependency normal and self-determination dangerous? The 2024 gold extraction record of 60 tons wasn't just a production milestone. It was a declaration of independence. Every ounce of gold that stayed in Burkina Faso instead of flowing to foreign shareholders was a blow against a system that has operated with impunity for centuries. By early 2025, when the government confirmed $1.1 billion in revenue from just the first quarter, the implications became impossible to ignore. This wasn't temporary success. This was a new model that could be replicated anywhere resources are extracted by foreign powers. The debt payments tell an even more powerful story. For decades, Burkina Faso had been trapped in cycles of borrowing from international institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These loans came with conditions that essentially forced the country to maintain the very policies that kept it poor. By using gold revenue to pay off external debts, Traoré achieved something revolutionary: financial independence. But the establishment wasn't going to let this slide quietly. The suspension from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, was designed to isolate Burkina Faso and force a return to the old system. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States, they weren't just creating a new regional partnership. They were building a firewall against external manipulation. 3 nations with enormous natural resources were declaring that they would no longer allow foreign powers to dictate their development paths. The rallies in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey weren't just celebrations. They were manifestos. Hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets to support leaders who prioritized national sovereignty over international approval. This was democracy in action, just not the kind that serves foreign interests. The international reaction revealed everything. Western nations that had never expressed concern about African poverty suddenly became very worried about governance and transparency. The same countries that had profited from exploitative contracts for decades began lecturing about democratic norms. Picture this: a landlocked nation in West Africa sits on enough gold to make its people millionaires. Yet children play in dust where schools should stand. Mothers give birth without medical care. Fathers walk miles for clean water. How is this possible? Why would a country with over 60 active gold mines and billions in precious metal exports remain trapped in poverty? The answer will shock you. What happened next will change how you see global power forever, and what one young soldier did about it. That's the story that has establishment powers around the world terrified. In less than 3 years, Ibrahim Traoré didn't just transform Burkina Faso. He exposed a system of exploitation so vast, so calculated, that it reveals the hidden architecture of how the world's wealth really flows. But here's what the international media won't tell you. This wasn't just about taking back gold. This was about detonating a blueprint for liberation that could reshape the entire global order. How did a 34-year-old artillery officer from a remote town accomplish what decades of politicians couldn't? What did he discover that made foreign powers scramble to contain him? And why are his methods now being studied by liberation movements across 3 continents? Let's unlock the most explosive story of our time, the heist that lasted a decade. To understand the magnitude of what Ibrahim Traoré accomplished, we first need to grasp the scale of what was stolen. This isn't a story about poverty. It's a story about the most sophisticated theft in modern history. Burkina Faso doesn't just have gold. It's sitting on an estimated 60 tons of the precious metal, extracted annually, with reserves that could sustain production for generations. The country ranks among the top 10 gold producers in Africa, with deposits so rich that artisanal miners can literally pan gold from rivers with their bare hands. But here's where this gets jaw-dropping. Despite being surrounded by billions in gold, 40% of Burkina Faso's population lived on less than $1.90 per day. Schools were so overcrowded that children attended in shifts. Hospitals were so understaffed that women gave birth on floors. Roads were so broken that entire regions became isolated during rainy seasons. The cruel mathematics of exploitation were hidden in plain sight. Foreign mining corporations, household names you'd recognize from stock exchanges in London, Toronto, and Sydney, had negotiated contracts so favorable that they kept up to 90% of profits while leaving the host nation with scraps. These weren't partnerships. They were perfectly legal pillaging operations. But the real scandal goes deeper. We're talking about secret agreements that exempted foreign companies from paying taxes, contracts that required the Burkina Faso government to build roads and infrastructure around mining sites, essentially forcing the nation to subsidize its own exploitation. Deals that gave foreign entities the right to displace entire communities without meaningful compensation. The environmental cost was staggering. Rivers turned toxic red from chemical runoff. Forests that had stood for centuries were cleared. Overnight, traditional farming communities found their ancestral lands transformed into industrial pits, their water sources poisoned, their children developing respiratory illnesses from dust and chemicals. And here's the part that will make your blood boil. The international community celebrated this as foreign investment and economic development. Development for whom? Investment in what? The only thing developing was the bank accounts of distant shareholders, while generations of Burkinabe families watched their heritage disappear into foreign coffers. By 2021, this systematic extraction had reached industrial scale. Gold accounted for nearly 70% of Burkina Faso's total exports. Yet the country remained classified among the world's least developed nations. The World Bank and IMF offered loans with restrictive conditions, essentially forcing the country to borrow money to survive while its own wealth was legally stolen. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine watching bulldozers destroy your grandfather's burial ground to access gold that would fund luxury shopping districts in Paris while your own children couldn't afford school supplies. Picture seeing foreign engineers drive past your village in air-conditioned vehicles toward mines that generated millions monthly while your community lacked basic electricity. This wasn't just economic inequality, it was cultural genocide disguised as globalization. But here's what the extractors didn't count on. The people were watching, the people were learning, and the people were getting angry. In remote military outposts, young officers like Ibrahim Traoré witnessed firsthand how foreign companies operated with impunity. They saw how local politicians became complicit in the theft. They understood that the problem wasn't just corruption. It was a system designed to perpetuate dependency and extract wealth with mathematical precision. The frustration was building across every level of society. Market vendors who couldn't afford to expand their stalls while millions in gold passed through their towns daily. Teachers who worked without supplies while mining companies reported record profits. Farmers who watched their fields become contaminated while foreign executives celebrated another successful quarter. But what happened next changed everything. Because in the midst of this orchestrated exploitation, an unlikely hero was preparing to do something unprecedented. The Captain's Gambit, September 30th, 2022. The day that sent shockwaves through boardrooms from London to Sydney. While foreign mining executives were probably reviewing their quarterly profits, a 34-year-old artillery officer named Ibrahim Traoré was executing the most audacious heist in reverse. He was stealing back an entire nation's wealth. But this wasn't just another military coup. This was a precision strike against a system that had been bleeding his country dry for decades. Picture the scene. In the early morning darkness, Traoré and his loyal soldiers moved through Ouagadougou like ghosts. No international news cameras were rolling. No foreign correspondents were standing by. The world was about to witness something it had never seen before, a military takeover that the people would celebrate in the streets. Within hours, President Marc Christian Cabaret was out. The old system was finished. And for the first time in generations, the people of Burkina Faso felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. But here's what made this different from every other military takeover you've heard about. Traoré didn't seize power to enrich himself. He seized power to expose the greatest financial crime in African history. His first move was pure genius. Instead of making typical political promises, he launched a comprehensive audit of every mining contract in the country. What his team discovered was so shocking that it changed everything we thought we knew about legal exploitation.